Alright, here we are with the first gen Scion. A lot of you that have a 5-speed manual Scion know that going down the freeway you have higher RPMs at cruising because these are pretty low geared vehicles. So today I'm going to do the 5th gear swap, which uses a 5th gear from a 2003 or newer Toyota Corolla. I got mine from Rock Auto. You can see the part number here. It's a USA standard gear, part number ZMC56-5. They had them in stock at Rock Auto and for substantially less than what you can get them for from the dealer. So you'll have the smaller gear and the larger gear. There are no bearings included, so if your bearings need attention, then you should get new bearings at the same time. I did not see bearings available on Rock Auto. Today I'll also be swapping out the fluid. I'm going to be using this Redline MT90. It's a GL4 high performance lubricant, full synthetic. You must use a GL4 rated fluid in your Scion or you will damage the synchros in the transmission because they are made out of brass and they will be corroded by the GL5 fluids. So I'm start out, open the hood. I'm not doing anything electrical, so I'm going to go ahead and leave the battery connected. I am going to disconnect the cold air intake as it will interfere with other things if I don't while removing and changing the 5th gear. You may also need to remove your factory air box to do this, but obviously I do not have a factory air box anymore, so I'm just going to undo this and just undo the connector and get it detached from the intake itself. And apparently I need a different socket. Okay, a different socket with an extension, and we will disconnect this the other section so I can disconnect it from the throttle body and rotate it out of the way. There we go. So that's disconnected from the throttle body. And now we're going to go ahead and lift it up. I do have the advantage of a 2-post lift because I'm a mechanic for a living. Alright, we are now up in the air, and I'm going to start by removing the wheels. Well, not all of them, just this one. Alright, got all the lug nuts off, and now the wheels off. Now once the wheel's off, you can see what you need to get to here. Well, see some other parts you need to remove. So this panel right here will need to be removed with a screw up there and back there. And you can take it all the way off, or you can just remove a couple of the screws and get it down out of your way. I'm just going to take a couple of the screws out to get it out of the way and go from there. And due to previous damages under my car, there are some zip ties holding stuff together so it doesn't touch the tire anymore. So I'll get rid of those. And then obviously I have to re-zip tie that when I put it all back together, but now that part of it's free. And I can remove these screws here. These are 10mm bolts that hold that on. They're relatively easy to get to and remove. Alright, we got those two 10mm bolts out. Now on mine there's a Phillips head screw here. Whether or not your car has this here, I do not know. This car is definitely not original and has definitely had hands in it before I owned it. And while analyzing things, I realized that there is also this screw here which attaches to the front bumper. And just one other nut here in the middle. It's actually a 2-piece lower cover so you can remove half of it and get it completely out of the way like that. So now it's totally open to access the transmission. I'm gonna go ahead and get this fluid draining. I've got my drain pan underneath it, and then I've got my drain plug right here. It will be a 15/16 socket or wrench to get it loose and start draining the fluid. Recommend removing the fill plug before removing the drain plug, or the fluid will glug and could make a mess and not fully drain. And I personally don't like making big messes, so I'm going to pull the fill plug. As you can see, I have a little bit of fluid coming out, so my level was fine there. I'll go ahead and get the bucket over here a little bit and get that drain plug out of there. And we're draining the fluid. This is actually GL5 because I did not know the spec when I changed the fluid, because I didn't change the fluid. I replaced the transmission because when I bought the car it had a bad transmission. So that's another reason I'm changing the fluid, to get this GL5 out and replace it with a GL4. Once the fluid's done draining, we'll remove this mount here. We'll just take out these two bolts, which are 14mm headed bolts, and we'll put a stand underneath the transmission here, and so we can access this cover and remove it to access our 5th gear. Alright, I now have a stand supporting the engine and transmission at the bell housing where they meet, and we're going to go ahead and take these two bolts out here. One and two. So those bolts are now out, and the engine transmission assembly can be rotated down for access. So we will lower the stand down. You can see it's just dropping down just fine here. And now it is actually free of the stand, so there are some, bring it back up just a little bit so it's supported and not just hanging there. So now you can see we've got this bolt here, 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 and there's a couple up here that you can't see, but we will be getting those with a wrench, just having to reach around the top here from the side. So we'll go ahead and get the bolts we can with the impact, make it easy. Can't quite get that one the impact, so we'll get the wrenches and sockets out. I went ahead and got the other two up top that you can't see with a wrench, which is hard to do that one-handed and record, so got the ratchet going the wrong way. So we'll get the last bolt here out of this cover. That's our last bolt holding the cover on. We'll go ahead and get it out of there. And then there are a couple spots you can get to pry off the cover. There's a tab here. If I can get it to focus on that. Right here, there's a tab. You can pry here against that mount. And there's another tab here where you can stick a screwdriver between the transmission case and the tab here. So, go ahead and use a handy dandy flathead here between the tab on the case here and pry it apart. As you can see, there is fluid in there. We'll pry on the other tab and get a little more apart. There are dowel pins that hold it on there as well. We have to break the seal because this is just stuck on there with a sealant and no gasket. And it looks like I will have to let it down just that little bit that I picked it back up so I can get the cover out of there. And here you have your 5th gear assembly. So you have your shift fork, your small driven gear, and your larger drive gear. You'll have to remove the shift fork, and you'll have to remove this clip here, and you'll have to use a puller to remove this from the shaft. You'll have to be careful with that because there is not much space to remove it without damaging it. You'll have to pull this plastic collar off before removing the gear itself. Okay, to remove the shift fork, there is a 10mm bolt right here, which is tighter than I expected it to be. A little different leverage point so I can put my hand on it better. So we'll remove this bolt. Okay, I've got the bolt loose and out, and this shift fork and plastic collar will slide off of the gear here. Make sure you don't drop anything. We'll just set this aside for now. Alright, some of you may have heard a slight click when I was removing the shift fork. This little piece right here is spring loaded with a clip that holds it in, that it kind of keeps tension on that plastic collar. And this clip here is the one I was talking about needing to be removed. I do not believe I can get it with one hand, but nope, it's going to take 2 hands because as you can see it's just rotating around. So I'm going to have to stop recording here and remove this clip with both hands because I can't do it with one. Okay, I used both hands to get the clip loose, or released a little bit, and now it's in my oil bucket, so it's out of the way. But as you can see, this gear doesn't just pull off, it has to be pulled off with a puller. So I'm going to get the pullers out and go from there. And this extra bolt I've got, I'm just sliding it in here to not damage the threads of the shaft, because the puller is going to be pushing right here on this bolt instead of the shaft. Alright, I've got my puller all set up on here. I've got a zip tie just to hold the jaws in there so nothing moves around too easily. 3-jaw puller is recommended because of the way you can get into the gear to remove it. One thing you want to make sure of is on the arms that they fit as deep as possible without touching this gear here on the inside. Because if it touches this gear and doesn't get a good engagement on this gear, you will break this gear. So be careful with that. Let's go ahead and get this thing coming off there. Of course, you never want to use air tools on a puller, especially when you're doing a fragile job. You just want to go slow and steady and let the tools do the work. And looks like I'm going to need my other hand to keep this from spinning. As you can see, we have safely removed it without breaking. Didn't damage the synchro and didn't damage the gear. So now there's another clip in here that holds this driven gear on, I believe. But then again, I could be wrong. Like, it looks like I am. So this gear just slides right off. You've got your bearing inside here. You want to make sure you don't lose your bearing. It is 2 pieces. So we'll carefully take this and set it aside. Now you can see our old gear here on the left with our new gear on the right. And then you can just take this bearing and slide it out real easily like that. Like I said, it's in 2 pieces, and you can just transfer it over to your new gear. So you take your 2 halves and then slide them over, and now the bearing is in the new gear. A little comparison. You can see the difference in size really isn't much between the 2 gears, but you can see that the new gear is slightly larger than the old gear, which will reduce your freeway RPMs by roughly 500 RPM at 60 miles an hour. So you'll be cruising at 2,500 instead of 3,000 RPM when you're doing 60. Alright, now that we have the drive gear off, it is time to remove the driven gear. Don't know the metric equivalent, but this is an 1 1/16 socket, which fits nice and snug. You will need an impact because there's really no way to hold that from turning while you're getting it loose unless you jam the gear somehow, and I prefer just not to put random objects in the gears because it could damage them even though they're being replaced. This gear, once you get the nut off, does not slide right off. There is a groove in the gear right here where you can install a puller and press it off the shaft. So I'll be doing that here in a second. So I got my bearing splitter or bearing knife put on here into the groove. It's the only one I got, so it's a little bit on the big side, but it fits. And I got my other 2-arm puller here. I know it's not ideal, but it'll function this way. I'll probably be needing both hands to get this off, but I'm gonna see if the air ratchet or the electric ratchet will get it off on its own. Well, it won't, so let me grab some manual ratchets. Alright, we've got the other gear taken off now. So now that it's down to this, with nothing on there and the gears all out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and clean off that excess the old silicone and start putting things back together. And just for comparison's sake, here's the old driven gear compared to the new driven gear, the new being on the left and the old being on the right. I guess I'll put that over there so I know which ones go to which. You can see there's a fair difference in size in these two as well. So a smaller driven gear means that it'll be a lower RPM going down the freeway. And this is my tool of choice for cleaning off silicone and gasket surfaces. So it's pretty simple and quick. Just the white wheel is safe for use. The white wheel is safe for use on aluminum without removing metal. It just removes the material that's on it. So I'm going to go ahead and get this cleaned up and we'll come back. And after getting it all cleaned off the best I couldn't get it everywhere with the die grinder, so I did have to use a scraper on some of it. And I went in and cleaned the cover while I was at it too. So time to put some gears back in it and let's get it back together. And the smaller gear is a press fit, so I'm going to give it a little bit of heat just to warm it up and expand it. And then I'll be using a hammer and socket to tap it on there the rest of the way until I can get a nut on it and get it down there. And I'm gonna have to look up what the torque spec is and get that nut torqued and set. I've got the smaller gear pressed down on there. Haven't bolted it on or torqued it yet, but I'm going to go ahead and slide the larger gear on there. Make sure your bearings get on there and don't screw those up. You get them to mesh together just like that. Make sure your bearing stays down in there. Then you add your synchro. That'll just slide on there. You can see it rotates around. You want to kind of line it up with some of the teeth. And you'll see that you've got notches in 3 spots around it. That engages with the other piece that slides over the top. So here's that other piece that slides on. It actually gets pressed on as well. It's the first thing we pulled off. You can see that there's no damage to anything. I've seen other videos where these have chipped on the edge here when they're removing them. So we'll go ahead and get that lined up and push down in there, and we'll actually bring the synchro out off of the other gear so we can line it up with those tabs. That way everything's lined up when it goes together and we don't crush anything or damage anything. This shaft is threaded on the inside, so I'm going to put a bolt in there and use the bolt to pull this down, pull this gear down to the other gear so I can get that final clip on there. And at that point I'll also put this nut on and torque it as well. This is how I'll be pressing that gear back on there using a socket that goes over the the part that sticks out on the gear, and then I've got a long full threaded bolt with a nut on it. I threaded the bolt into the shaft, and I'll be using the nut to push it down onto the shaft. And it's actually going pretty easy, so I can record and show you at the same time that I'm just using that nut to work it down the threads, and you can see that the gear is getting pressed onto that shaft and closing up the gap there. So I want to make sure that everything stays in place and you don't drop your synchro out while it's going down, because you don't want to crush your synchro, otherwise you'll have to pull it all back apart anyways. And there it is, all pressed on all the way down. And you can see that the synchro still has room to move in there, and you can get the clip on here to retain this gear. So we'll go ahead and put that clip back in there. Right there. I'm going to have to grab some pliers so I can squeeze it in there. For this, you want to make sure you've got a good grip, because you don't want to damage the splines, because if you do ever have to do this again, it'll make it a little tougher getting the gear off. But as you can see, just clip back in there. Just need to get that nut on there and get it torqued, and put the shift fork back on, and we'll be going back together and putting the cover on and be almost done. Alright, the nut is back on and torqued to 87 foot-pounds as per the instruction manual. Just need to clean off any residual oil in this area and put some sealant on the cover. Oh, gotta get the shift fork back on, so can't forget about that part, I guess. Okay, we've got our shift fork here, and you'll notice there's two large grooves here. They will line up with this part here and here and go around this. You have to make sure you get it lined up properly to get it to go on there, and then of course at the same time you have to, so I guess get the fork on the lever first, and then align the splines with this gear here and get it all pressed together. And get your bolt back in there and get it aligned and get your bolt back in there. So need to clean the bolt off and actually put some Loctite on it. And the manual calls for Tri-Bond or Loctite 242, which is blue Loctite, so we just went with blue Loctite since I didn't feel like going to the dealer to get Tri-Bond. Put it back in there. It does have a torque spec, but it is not a crucial torque spec, so I'm just going to get it good and snug. Good and snug with about the same amount of effort that it took me to remove it. And I feel comfortable with it not coming loose. So now I just need to clean off the gasket surfaces, apply some sealer to the cover, and get the cover installed. Alright, I've got sealer applied to the cover. You can see that I cleaned it up real nice. That little thing there that sticks out, that's actually what lubricates your fifth gear synchros and shift mechanism. So you want to make sure that that's all cleaned out. And you can see I got all the oil cleaned off all the surfaces here, and time to get that cover back on. And goes on over the dowel pins, give it a little tap, and start putting bolts in. Alright, we'll get those all snugged up. And Alright, we got all the screws started, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and go ahead and... Alright, got the cover back on, all the bolts are snugged up tight, and you can see this sealant just barely pushed out the edges, just like it would have from the factory. I use Right Stuff for a sealant. Use it on just about everything, and I've never had a single complaint about it. So now we'll bring this back up here and get the mounts back in the bolt, or the bolts back in the mount. Got my screw jack here to get it up there and get it up in place, and just put a little bit of tension on it and then grab those bolts. I got my bolts, get them started here. It's always best to hand start your hardware instead of using any kind of tools to do it, because you run the risk of cross-threading and damaging stuff if you don't. Alright, I got my impact back. We'll go ahead and give these a couple ugga-duggas. So, there's our ugga-duggas. We can take our stand out, put our drain plug back in, and fill her with fluid, and put our plastic cover back on and be good to go. Alright, we got fluid back in. It's just down to a little drip there from the fill plug. After pulling the cover off and everything else, it was just over 2 quarts, which the capacity was rated at 2 quarts, but I like to use the fill plug as a level plug as well, which is typical for a lot of these. So I also kind of made a little bit of a mess because the hose popped off my pump. So I'll go ahead and get that snugged up and get the plastic cover back on. Alright, and the final piece besides wheel and tire is this plastic cover. So go ahead and get it going back on there. And I know I just mentioned not using a power tool or anything else to start bolts, but on these little 10mm ones, it's not likely that you're going to mess up the threads, and even if you do, it's a pretty quick fix because there's such a small item. It's easy to get around that. But if you're careful, you can still get it either way. And get some nuts. And this piece is actually part of the bumper. Get that lined up. And then the one random screw we had on here was actually a self-tapping screw, so not original to the car, but it was put on there because this plastic was hanging low and dragging on the ground. As you can see, that it's partially disintegrated there. So we just put it back in there to keep that plastic from dragging on the ground. And I do have another set of wheels and tires that I was going to put on it while I was doing this. There we go, different wheels on there now. Well, one different wheel. I still got to put the rest of them on, but I'm going to get the rest of the wheels put on, and then we'll torque the wheels on and take it for a drive and see how she does. All the wheels are on and snugged up with the impact. I'm going to bring it down to earth and torque the wheels and tires and put the air intake back on and take it for a drive. Alright, wheels are on and torqued. Time to get this air intake back on. And that's our last step. Yeah, no, it's not exactly a good air intake. It's just a cheap eBay one. But it works.